Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. You got Steve and I here in the Rent Prep offices, and we got a special guest on the podcast today. And I found Tracy Z actually from doing some research on notes. It's been something that Steve and I have been talking about in the office, and I was pretty impressed with the amount of content and great content out there online from her website. So I reached out and Tracy, we're real glad and happy to have you on the podcast today to tell us a little bit about notes and kind of inform us on some questions we have.
Thanks. I appreciate being here.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So, Tracy, I'll read a little bit of your brag sheet here, if we want to call it that. But just so our listeners know that, this is the real deal here. So, Tracy Z, she has handled millions of dollars in seller finance real estate notes since 1988. You have headed up the due diligence department for one of the nation's largest note buyers as VP of production. Loving the note business, but wanting to work for herself, Tracy left the institutional investor side in 1997 to start Diversified Investment Services, Inc., which is a note buying company, and also noteinvestor.com. That's where I found Tracy from. And that has an online newsletter and learning center. So Tracy specializes in the use of tax-advantaged retirement funds to purchase real estate notes and works with private investors through Notes Direct Online, note trading platform, as project manager. So that's a little bit of background, Tracy, but tell us anything that I didn't cover in here. I mean, did you start with notes? I mean, how did you get involved with notes? Because I know before we jumped on the podcast, you were saying that you also do some buy and hold real estate, and you have rental properties as well. How did you get involved with notes in the beginning?
Well, my very first introduction to the world of note investing was when I worked for a title company. So there used to be somebody that came in and paid us to go through all of the recordings to find deeds of trust, mortgages, contract for deeds, where the person receiving payments was not an institution, was not a bank like you would typically see, but was an individual or maybe a private small trust or a little LLC or something along those lines. And so that I was like, why are they doing this? Well, they were trying to get a list of privately held debt that they could then market to. So that was, before everything was online, way back in the 80s, and a lot of things had to be done manually. So we would go through the records and manually get that information so they could mail to them. So that was my first introduction back when I was in the title world. And then I went to work for an institutional investor who bought notes through a variety of funds, and I headed up their closing department. So I took my title background, moved that into the closing area. And that's where I really learned about the investing side, about return on money and collections and due diligence. And my whole world was open to me. And I moved from the closing side to, the actual underwriting and production, and became VP there before I went out on my own. So that's sort of how I got brought up into it. First by accident, then on purpose, and then later moved from doing it for a company for doing it myself.
So Tracy, take us through for the average listener, somebody who maybe they invest in real estate, they buy and hold, or maybe they have experience, wholesaling or different aspects of real estate investing, but don't really know what a note is, what the world of notes consists of. Can you break it down in the simplest form that you can think of for somebody who may not have any idea at all what a note is or how to invest in a note?
Absolutely. So when I was first starting in investing, the company I worked for wouldn't let us buy notes because it was a conflict of interest, but we could buy real estate. So I did hold real estate for quite a few years until I went out on my own and then was able to start buying notes. So I look at it one more active and one more passive. So with real estate is stuff, right? It's a hard asset. So when you buy real estate, you own that real estate, and it has to get taken care of. So, if you're the landlord and you rent it out, the toilet's plugged up, you get a call, right? The mailbox is broken, kids broke the windows, you name it, it'll happen. Everybody who's been a landlord knows this, right? So when you have a note, you are the bank. You get to be the bank. So you hold this note, you're the bank, and it's backed by real estate. So you only have to deal with the real estate if the people don't make the payments on the note. They don't make the payments to the bank. And then as the bank, if they don't make the payments, yes, you try to work it out. You try to get them to pay just like you would with the landlord. But as the bank now, you're going to have to foreclose and take the property back, or maybe get a deed in lieu of foreclosure if you can't find a way to get them to start making their payments again. So that's the main difference. Is probably, one, you're owning the real estate, and the other side, you are receiving the payments from somebody who bought the real estate. You're basically a lien holder on the real estate.
How risky is investing in notes?
Well, that all depends on how you buy it, right? So you've got to look at a variety of things. You're going to have to look at the payer, the person making the payments. What's their credit history in the past? I imagine it's a little bit like you screen tenants, through your system, right? I bet it would be very similar. I was going through your website, and I was like, I wonder how well it would be fun to take a note payer and run them through your tenant screening system and see how, just kind of, it'd be interesting to see that result.
Right. Well, as an investor, do you get to see the person's personal information, like their credit report and things like that?
So it depends on, you're asking a lot of good questions. So it depends on where you are in the process.
Okay.
As you probably know, there's something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the provisions in the Fair Credit Reporting Act is that if you're an investor or a potential investor on an existing debt, which a note and a mortgage or a note and deed of trust are, then you have the right to review that party's credit.
Okay.
So you've got to make that legal link that you are a potential investor. So there's a couple of ways to do that. The best way to do it is to get some sort of signed agreement or option or authorization from the party that's currently the lender on the deed of trust or the note or the mortgage, the person currently receiving the payment. So that would be on a note that already exists. So I always caution when I say things like this because, I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV. So consult with your own legal advisor. But there's links on our website to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And it's pretty clear that if you are an investor, a potential investor, or you're the current creditor, that you have the right to do that. So you've just got to make that link. If you're looking to buy the note, then you're looking at stepping in the shoes of the existing creditor. So you just got to make that link. Now, if it's a new note, it doesn't exist yet, then obviously you would get the payer, the borrower, to sign an authorization to uphold their credit.
Sure.
Can you explain to me that, like the situation when somebody would have a new note versus one that's previously existing? I mean, I think I understand there's a mortgage already out there and they can't make payments on it, but how does a new note come into play?
Seller financing.
Okay.
Yep. So a lot of times, I know it's not as popular right at the moment because the real estate market's booming again, but there's always a certain segment of real estate that's hard to finance. So a lot of your low bandwidth valued properties are tough to get financing on. We find that mobile home and land's always tough to get financing on. Land, a borrower with maybe some credit challenges, maybe a borrower that is self-employed, doesn't have the 2 years of tax returns that a bank might want. So all these little things that would cause a traditional bank, conventional lending to say no. Now the seller might consider, hey, I'll still sell to this buyer, this borrower, but I'm going to let them pay me instead of paying the bank. And so that may seem like a good idea to that seller at the time, or maybe they don't have a lot of other options. They go because variety of reasons. Some people own real estate and they sell with owner financing on purpose because they want to get the interest income, right? They don't want the bank to get it.
Right.
So there's all kinds of strategies, but once a seller sells on seller financing, then they may or may not want to wait until 15, 20, 30 years until the note pays off. And then they can sell or assign their rights to future payments to an investor like us. So we'll come in and buy all or part of those payments on the note mortgage or note deed of trust. We buy them at a discount. So not only do we receive the interest income on the note, but we also have that discount built in there, which makes our yield, our ROI, higher than the interest rate on the note. I personally buy a lot of performing notes. I know it's huge right now to buy the non-performing. And I know a lot of people who like the REOs, the fix and flips, they'll buy the non-performing notes, plan on foreclosing, so they have some inventory for their fix and flips or to turn into a rental. So that is another segment of the market as well, the non-performings. And those tend to get bought out of banks, hedge funds, that trickle-down waterfall effect. So two very different segments of the market: performing notes through seller financing and non-performing notes through banks. So very different strategies in how you approach, market, and underwrite those.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned has been something that I've been reading about as I'm researching notes, and that was that trickle down effect. One of the negatives that I read about notes was that for like a regular guy like myself who maybe wants to get into note investing, is it's harder to get and I apologize if I'm saying this wrong, but it's harder to find the good deals because a lot of these bigger investment firms have already gobbled up a lot of the market and you're kind of getting what's left over. Could you explain that to me and maybe explain why that's wrong or right, or your opinion on that?
Sure. So that is going to apply to the non-performing note segment. That's not going to apply to the performing seller finance segment. Because
just because I'm the one who never knows anything on this podcast, non-performing notes, that's if somebody is not paying, making payments, and then performing is just they've been steadily making payments, but for whatever reason, you're going to pull and take over that note then.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's right. It's just like it sounds, exists like you explained. But the big difference is most of the performing notes where people are on time with their payments don't get sold by the banks to private investors.
Okay.
Most of that paper gets sold on Wall Street, turned into mortgage-backed securities, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where most of the bank performing paper goes. So most of the performing notes that you see for a private investor are those that originated through seller financing.
Okay.
And that's on average, depending on where you live, plus or minus 6% of all residential real estate transactions. That percentage is higher on hard to finance property. It's higher on commercial and some of those other things we already talked about. So that's one segment of the market. And that doesn't have a trickle down effect. That has you've got to get out there and find those sellers that took back financing and market to them. Direct mail, social media, SEO, online marketing. You've got to find them because you can't do a direct mail campaign to them in general because if you have 100 people and only 6 out of 100 took back a note, you've got to find them. And so most people will buy lists of note holders that or private that took back financing. You can do that now without going to the title company. So it's 2018, right? Not 1988. So we have much easier ways of getting those lists. So that's that piece of the market. Now I'm going to switch over to the other piece of the market, and that's the non-performing piece. And those are the notes that usually come from some bank originated paper. So they were once upon a time a loan, not seller financing, but a loan. And they didn't perform. And a lot of them are still around from the subprime meltdown in 2007, 8, 9, 10, that arena. And so they are getting released and sold over time. So usually the big hedge funds gobble them up. And then they might pick off what they like and they'll sell to a smaller fund. And they might pick off what they want and they'll sell to a smaller fund. And maybe they have some private investors that pick them up. So that's that waterfall or trickle down effect that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And do they get picked over as they go through the waterfall? Yeah, I mean, it's a waterfall because, right, the stream, gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right, as it goes down. You get this big flood and then it trickles out. So you do have to be careful when you're buying the non-performing. And as a private note investor, unless you've got $500,000 or more to take down a small portfolio and then sell off the ones you don't like, you're probably just going to buy one or two. So now where do you find them? So one of the things that's been one of the challenges. And so one of the things that we're seeing happening is there's these MLS style listing services that will list notes for sale online. So they're trying to connect these larger hedge funds with the smaller private institutional investor that just wants to buy one note at a time, not a big portfolio of 100 notes. And so that's, things like Notes Direct that I work with and FCI Exchange and some others are out there doing the MLS style note listings, trying to bridge that market a little bit better.
Okay. I know for a couple of times you've mentioned earlier, you said something about partial notes. So can somebody actually buy just a partial note? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so you can buy part of a note. Most people who buy partials, if there's, say, 30 years left on a note, they'll buy the next 10 or 15, and they'll leave the rest on the back end. So if you bought 15 on a 30-year note, you would receive the first 15. Then when those payments paid off, then the person who you bought from would get the remaining 15 years. So it helps lessen the discount and keep that interest working for the party that's on the back end, the tail end of that note. So the great thing about partials is it lowers your upfront investment and you get a chance to make sure that the payer is going to pay. So one of the things you asked about earlier is how dangerous is it? How risky is it? And one of the things that we look at in addition to the payer's credit is we look at the equity. How much money did they put down, or has the property gotten to be worth more compared to what their balance on their note is? Another thing that we look at is how much am I investing? So what is the amount I invest to the value of the property? So we call that ITV, or investment to value. And so that investment to value is much lower on a partial. And so that's one of the ways that you can protect yourself. And then when you see the note performing, if the seller wants to sell the rest of the notes, rest of the payments, then you can come in and buy the rest of those.
Okay. One of the things that I think is really interesting, probably for some of our listeners too, because we definitely get some landlords who deal with a lot of the headaches of managing tenants, and they're listening to this and like, all right, well, this sounds like, this could be potentially a lot less headaches. I mean, what's the downside of investing in notes? I think one of the things I've heard from previous guests is that it can be kind of boring as far as there's maybe like a lot of like paperwork and different kind of stuff that you have to get involved with that. Or I mean, what's the downside if a landlord's thinking about getting involved in notes?
Well, one downside that we don't talk a ton about is we don't actually get the benefit of the appreciation when a property goes up in value, right? Because we don't own the property, we own the note. So the owner of the property gets that appreciation. Now we get some phantom appreciation, some phantom benefit in that a person who has a lot more equity, so property is worth a lot more than when they bought it, they're much less likely to default and stop paying.
Mm-hmm.
So we're more protected, but that isn't really going to come into play probably because since they have so much, they being the payer, the borrower, the owner, since they have so much equity, they're less likely to default. So that's one of the downsides of buying notes is you don't get the direct benefit of appreciation because you're not the owner of the property, you're the bank, right?
Yeah. So typically if I was to buy a rental property, I want to kind of look at the neighborhood and maybe have an idea of how that neighborhood is going to change in the coming years. That maybe doesn't come into as much of like play with this because you're not worried about the appreciation. But what terms as far as like the housing market, like what do you need to be paying attention to in the housing market if you're interested in getting into notes?
I would say it's very similar to what you look at as a landlord. I mean, you want to make sure that where's the neighborhood going? Is it turning for the better or the worse? We look at all the same kind of crime rate factors that I'm sure somebody buying a rental property looks at. The school factors. So we look at all those things in addition to looking at the creditworthiness of the payer and the equity and our ITV and the terms and the collateral. I mean, we have to go through the collateral files. A lot of these notes that came down through that waterfall effect with banks might have some collateral file deficiencies. And that would be another thing, like you'd already mentioned. It can be a little bit boring. You've got to understand the documentation side because that's a big piece of it when you're buying a note.
Yeah. Could you explain? You said collateral deficiencies. So what do you mean by that?
So we talk about a collateral file. So that's the documents that make up the file that places the lien on the property. So if somebody doesn't pay on a note, the worst case scenario is you're going to have to take the property back through foreclosure. So you want to make sure that that collateral is secured by the right documents. So those documents make up the collateral file. So you've got your note, your mortgage, your assignment of mortgages, your endorsements to the note, your allonges to the note. You probably want to get title or some kind of title report or O&E report. We usually recommend some kind of BPO, talking about what you already did about, property's current value, what are comparables, what's the neighborhood doing. So those are all things we like to see a payment history. If it's an existing note, how well are they making payments on that note? We like to know that the property is insured in case it should burn down or you've got some kind of forced place insurance in place. We want to make sure real estate taxes are current. So, those can come in, even a first position note or mortgage, those can take priority. Real estate taxes can over everything. So those are some of the things you look at when you're looking at a collateral file.
Now, and when you're dealing with a note that you own and then it starts to not perform, right? They start to default, they start to not pay. You as the note holder, are you responsible for the eviction filing or the foreclosure filing and those type of filings?
Yeah, so most people in the note business now hire a servicing agent, and that third-party servicing agent will take care of that. But yes, you will, as the holder of that note, you have to go through all those legal processes. They vary by state. You don't really worry about the eviction notice until you've got your foreclosure, right? It depends on whether the tenant's in there, it's an owner occupant, but you have to go through the legal process of filing for foreclosure, notice of demand, filing for foreclosure, evicting as necessary. So all of that you would use an attorney to assist with, or your servicing agent sometimes has have those services available. But that third-party servicer is very important for making sure you stay compliant with any servicing regulations.
Sure. Now, how does that affect, as an investor, I've got a note, all of a sudden it starts to not perform. I've got to go through the foreclosure process. I'm assuming that those legal bills or paying the servicing agent, that's all coming out of my pocket as the investor, right?
That is correct, yes.
So how do I, as an investor, recoup that? Or, if you're working on a 6% interest on a note, is that a loss at that point? Or I got to just hang on to that note longer to help try to recoup and to recover some of that?
No, you will recover that. Either the borrower will bring it current, and they'll be responsible for those because there's provisions in most note mortgages that they're responsible for those costs. Or if it goes to sell, then whoever comes in and pays off that or purchases it at the courthouse steps, so to speak, then that amount gets paid back to you there as well. Mm-hmm. And if nobody bids on it and you end up with the property, then the worst case scenario is you'd recoup those when you sold the real estate. Gotcha. When you had it as REO. So you do get them back, but it takes time. Right. It takes an outlay of money up front, right? Before, right. Additional funds. Just like if you own a piece of property and there needs a new roof, you've got to figure out how to pay for the roof. You can't just say, oh, well, right? Right. So same with having to go through foreclosure or protecting your interest against delinquent taxes. You're going to have some kind of reserves for that and be prepared for that. And then it's time, your return on investment goes down over time. So that's an issue. And also your just personal time that you've got to invest in hassling with it, that commitment goes up. Right. So good questions. Yeah. Because those are the realities and not every note pays.
Right. Now, tell me or explain, maybe you can debunk this myth. We work with a lot of municipalities. And I work with specifically on a lot of nuisance abatement programs. And I know that notes have kind of historically gotten a bad reputation in some areas where they blame a lot of note investing on absentee landlordism and problems in communities, things like that. Is there any reality to that, or that has nothing to do with the note market whatsoever?
Well, I think where some of that has come from are investors that got a glut of properties, and then they sold them on a contract for deed, which is very different than a note mortgage and a note deed of trust. And in that situation, they stay as the fee simple title holder until the buyer makes all their payments. And then when the buyer makes all their payments, they get the deed to the property. Mm-hmm. Whereas with a deed of trust or a mortgage, the deed goes to that buyer up front. They're vested in fee simple, and then the lender, the bank, the seller finance party, if that's what it is, they get back a mortgage and a note or a note and deed of trust. They're just a lien holder. But with a contract for deed, that seller stays on the property as the owner. So in those cases, they are the ones a lot of times that are getting all those notices. And maybe when they bought the property and resold it, they didn't fix it properly, perhaps, or there were all these nuisance filings and they didn't take care of them before they sold it to a new unsuspecting buyer who maybe wasn't sophisticated enough to get title to even know these things existed. Right. So I do not think that's the normal note investor, but there was a glut of them that did come in on the market and preyed, I think, in the downturn in the subprime lending, and we're seeing that getting flushed out right now. Right. So there are certain areas where that has been an issue, but I would argue, there's 90% that are good and they're doing it the right way. Right.
Tracy, the thing I'm kind of curious about, so let's say some of our listeners are thinking about getting involved with this. And I mean, you've got so much experience of dealing with note investors, and you've probably seen some people coming in without much experience, but you probably start recognizing the traits of people who are going to make a good note investor and people that are really going to figure out and make a good living off of this versus the people that are going to crash and burn. What are those characteristic traits? I mean, what have you seen over your years of experience that maybe, kind of separates the good investor from the bad investor for somebody who's starting out?
I really like to see an investor start out by learning it, learn the ropes by doing it. So if you can partner up with someone, or you can find a note and refer it to an investor and earn a fee and see how the process works before you invest your own funds. If you're going to invest your own funds, then definitely become knowledgeable, and you have to understand documents, and you have to embrace the boring. And if you don't want to do that, then you need to hire somebody to do that process for you. Definitely, I think people need to get some sort of title insurance or title report. I think that people who start out in non-performing notes, I would say you're trying to run a marathon before you train for a 5K. So you need to start with, my opinion, start with some performing notes. Get a few of those under your belt. Unless you're somebody who's done a lot of fix and flips, a lot of REOs, those sort of things where you are knowing what to expect, I wouldn't jump into the non-performing notes. I would learn a little bit by referring a deal, and I would buy a performing note first.
So let's say you got somebody like me who just bought Bitcoin a couple months ago, and now I'm manically looking at Bitcoin every single day to watch what the market's doing and how much money I'm losing or gaining. If you're a note investor, not the same. Like, you can't track this day to day. You got to be a patient investor in that sense, where you can't go in and look at from day to day what your return on investment was. It's more of a long-term view, and I don't want to say set it and forget it, but you're not necessarily going to be checking in on it frequently.
Well, it's monthly. Most payments are made monthly. So you're definitely wanting to check in on it monthly. And the way you would look at your return is, we do time value of money computations. So you look at what you invest versus how that money gets paid back. And that's basically your yield or your return on investment. But yeah, it's a long play. There are some ways to accelerate returns. So if you're a note buyer and you get paid, if you bought at a discount and you get paid off early, then you can accelerate your returns. So you might have turned a 10 to 12% investment into a 20 or 30% investment if you can accelerate the returns. But the downside of early payoffs, another one of those things you said, what's the positive, what's the negative? The downside, the negative of early payoff, is that while your returns go up, now you've got to redeploy that capital. So if you can't redeploy it at the same good investment rate that you did previously, then you're probably going to earn a lower return on when you reinvest it. So that's the one side. You've always got to be redeploying your capital when you're a note investor.
So, may not be related whatsoever, but I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on this as a expert in the note market. How do you compare it to investing in real estate tax liens? And do you have any experience in that area, in that market?
I have bought some deals that were tax deeds. So the lien had already been turned into a deed. And then we sold that using owner financing. And then we created a note, and then we sold those notes off. But I have not ventured into the tax lien because, for me, it was always the unknown of when are you going to even be able to get the property and turn it into something. Those yields have been getting bid down so far. So I've looked at it more from the tax deeds versus the tax liens personally. Have you guys done a lot of the tax liens or tax deeds?
It's funny. I have not looked a ton into the tax deeds, more so on the lien side. My background, I came from credit and collection world. And so the idea of purchasing debt is nothing new to me at all. And I'm very familiar with the risk and the reward potential, that you have with it. So it's interesting to me, the deed side of it, tax deed side versus just the tax lien. So that's definitely something I would check out.
Yeah, well, you just know that you're getting the property with the tax deed, right? It's already been through that whole process of redemption.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And, there's so many ways to skin a cat as a real estate investor. And it's funny that we, when you talk to somebody, I think in our world that we surround ourselves with so many landlords, it's usually pretty one-dimensional, but every once in a while, somebody will mention that they're into notes or they're into buying tax liens or whatever it is. And it's just always fascinating to remember, like, oh, there's so many different ways to do it. And there's, there's so many different layers to this and opportunities out there. So yeah, it's super interesting.
Yeah, one of the areas I think that's very underserved in the note market right now, because performing notes, there's a lot of competition for the seller finance performing. There's a lot of competition for the non-performing. But a couple of the areas that are underserved in the note market are going to be mobile home notes that are on rented lots instead of mobile home and land, because now you're dealing with personal property, chattel property, right? Something titled through the DMV, because there's no land attached to it. They're just paying lot rent on the land. So those are great for a local private investor because, they have more risk. They're called mobile for a reason, right? They could be moved, but they're not as easy to move as we all like to think, right? So that's one area that I think that's very underserved is that mobile home market. Land notes, there's still not a ton of competition in the land notes. Business notes, the same way. So there are some areas out there of the note market that are really great for a small private investor that they won't find themselves competing all the time with the bigger institutional buyers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just learning so much as you're talking here. I mean, a lot of this stuff is new, and like Steve was saying, you just don't even think about it if you kind of get in that landlord and buying rentals kind of mindset. And there's just so many different ways to make money out there. If somebody's listening right now and they're thinking about maybe, like you said, the first step should really be getting more educated on it before you really jump in the deep end. What's the first place you'd send them to? I know you got a lot of resources. What would you tell that person?
Well, there are a lot of places to learn online. I mean, even our site, noteinvestor.com, I think we're up to 350 free articles on that site. And we're not the only company out there that provides a lot of free information. Of course, there's also, paid trainings out there. I don't know how you guys feel or promote Bigger Pockets or not, but there's a lot of activity on Bigger Pockets where people can go in the forums and ask questions as well. So there's a lot of people out there that have been in this business since the 80s that are sharing their knowledge. And so, I'm not trying to say you must buy this training, but there are a lot of free resources to at least get you started. We have a free 21 tips for investing in real estate notes that we provide people, as well as 5 ways to cash in a note. So we talk about the different ways, whether you're a broker or an investor, or you're selling the real estate. So those are all the things to look at and explore, and really think about whether you want to be in the performing end or the non-performing end, and know your risk tolerance. I always say, are you investing with Vegas money or grocery money? So for slow and steady, you want first position performing notes on residential properties with good equity. If you're the Vegas money, if you can afford to lose that money, then you might be looking at higher risk deals, which I would consider non-performing, second liens, lower equity deals, lower credit scores on the payers. There's going to be much higher chance for returns, but there's going to be a lot higher risk as well. So just make sure you know that your investment type and you understand the volatility and what you're going to do if the note goes bad, and you've got some kind of tracking mechanisms in there to make sure, is the note paid? Are the taxes paid? Is the insurance current?
Yeah, I'm just curious on, as far as tracking, is there software? I don't think I've ever come across. I can't, in my trying to go through my mind thinking about, I'm pretty up to date on, real estate tech and what's out there. Is there anything that's specifically designed to track note performance and kind of like an account management for putting all your notes into?
Yeah, so T-value is what we use for the calculation side, or if you're old school like myself, I use T-value and an HP12C, and that's the calculation side. You can track the rest of it in an Excel spreadsheet. There are some new companies that have come online that are actually what we found through working with people that have an engineering background or a software development background. We're seeing a lot of these people very interested in notes because they don't want the hands-on of owning real estate, but they really like the idea of owning the cash flow that's backed by the real estate. So we've seen a lot of them come into the market as private investors using their self-directed retirement accounts, and they're starting to develop some of the programs that you're talking about, tracking and due diligence and checklists and really bringing us current with the markets. And then places like notesdirect.com, we have a whole collateral file uploaded that people can look at because we don't want them to have to be chasing everything. They can still do all the due diligence they want, but at least they've got the basics to start looking at and not have to chase down all the documents. So yeah, there's some software that's coming along now. And if you search for that, you can see that, find it online, if you look for note investing software.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
So if people are looking, they can go to notesdirect.com and see some of that software that you're mentioning. And then also, if you're really just trying to learn about note investing, go to noteinvestor.com. That's Tracy's website. That's how I found her. I started reading some blog posts on notes, and I was like, you know what? I keep seeing the same author at the end of these blog posts. I'm going to reach out to her and see if she wants to be on the podcast. So Tracy, thank you for being on the podcast and sharing your insights. Just so much knowledge and experience, and it's really great getting your perspective on notes. And if anybody's got any questions, I'm sure that they can, comment on a blog or something on your website. But go to noteinvestor.com to check that out.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate you guys having me here. I'm a big believer in owning real estate or owning notes backed by real estate. So, no matter what side of the fence you sit on, or a lot of us do both, I think we're all part of the same family. The notes become more passive as you want to travel more. I can be in Central America and manage my notes. It's hard to be in Central America and manage rental property unless I've got a good property management company. So
Sure.
I don't think there's a right or wrong. It just kind of depends on what interests you at this time of your life and what serves your purposes, right? We talk about lifestyle investing. So which one's more investment in your lifestyle right now? And that can change over the years.
Yeah, totally makes sense.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, especially the groceries and the Vegas one. I really like that too.
Yeah.
I like people who are good with analogies.
Although I feel like when I go to Vegas, I spend grocery money.
No, that's what I don't want you to do.
Yeah.
That's not something you're supposed to admit on the podcast.
Yeah,
Steve,
I go there with a very tight wallet. Like, all right, I'm going to spend $100 in this casino, and if I win, great. If I don't, I'm down $100, so I can live with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's funny because I'm not a big Vegas gambler either. People ask me, I say, no, I buy notes. I have enough.
Yeah, you gamble enough, right? Yeah.
Calculated gambling.
I'm an entrepreneur. My whole life is a gamble, basically. I don't need to go to Vegas and gamble more, right? Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time, Tracy. And we wish you the best of luck with everything you got going on with noteinvestor.com. It's a great resource. Again, go and check it out if you're listening still. You'll really find a lot of great insights on there. So thanks for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for your time.